what young people are asking for is a reimagining of racial justice in this country, a reimagining of politics and who can participate and who can be at the table, a reimagining of how we treat our planet, and not just taking from it, but also ensuring that there's something to be left for future generations.
Hi, I'm Danielle DiLeo Kim, Executive Director of Philadelphia 250. In 2026, the country will commemorate the 250th anniversary of American independence. So I invite you to listen in and get inspired to take action as Philadelphia 250 brings together thought leaders and change makers to share what those founding promises mean to them now and in the pursuit to 2026. Today, I'm excited to talk with Natalie Nixon and Jamira Burley about revolutionary actions. We'll explore what it means to challenge old assumptions, to use creativity to think differently, and what we can learn from the next generation as we prepare for America's 250th anniversary of American independence in 2026. Hi to both of you. Thank you for joining me today for this super exciting conversation we're going to have. Natalie, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to us?
I am Natalie Nixon. I am the president of Figure 8 Thinking, and I'm a creativity strategist and the author of The Creativity Leap.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jamira Burley, and I am a social justice activist. I work on issues related to gun violence, criminal justice reform, and global education. I'm also the head of youth engagement and skills at the Global Business Coalition for Education, and I am super excited to be a part of this conversation.
Thank you. Well, I am really excited to be here with both of you. This is something I've been looking forward to for a while. Both of you bring so much energy and creativity to what you do, and really unique thinking, which is what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. The theme of today's conversation is revolutionary actions. So I'm super excited to be here with both of you to talk about that. So before we get into that, why don't each of you tell me a little bit more about what you do? And Jamira, you introduced yourself with a really impressive list of titles. I'd love to know a little bit more about what you do under all those different roles.
Mm-hmm. A lot of my work has centered around at the intersection of youth policy and social impact. And so since I've started my career first as a youth activist, it's always been around how do I ensure pathways to young people having access to traditional institutions of power, to be a part of the process, to have their voices heard, and to use their unique experience as a way to add texture to policies and practices, and also to potentially move our communities and our country forward. In addition to that, I work for a global NGO that focus is how do we engage unlikely partners in the conversation of enabling education for the most vulnerable communities around the world. So we work with corporations on how they invest their CSR dollars and their charitable dollars into public education, as well as putting pressure on local governments to invest more, because we know that when young people have an education, it creates pathways for them to be more active citizens, but also to be able to reinvest in their communities and in their families.
Natalie, you have a long storied career too. Tell us a little bit more about it, what you're up to these days.
So as a creativity strategist, I advise leaders and executive teams on how to get to transformation. A lot of the time it's around business transformation, and increasingly it's also around personal transformation, because organizational change is inside out work. And I help them to get to that transformation by applying techniques from creativity and foresight. I have a very loopy background in cultural anthropology and fashion, and I was a professor for 16 years. And so I'm at an incredibly amazing place right now in my career and my life, where all of those divergent paths have converged into one to help me do my work's mission, which is to change lives with ideas and help people build a creative confidence for years to come so they can make impact and be paid their worth.
That's great. And I love the term loopy background. I'm going to steal that from you and use that. It's a good description about my own background. I think some people know I'm an architect and urban designer by training, and have spent almost all of my entire career in Philadelphia working on long-range plans for the city and doing a lot of community development work. Jamira, you just touched on some of those things that are going on now. What other like immediate issues do you think that you're hearing from your youth engagement or from the other work you're doing that needs to be centered in this conversation about a positive future in which we're addressing issues of injustice and trying to deliver on promises? What do we need to be focused on now to prepare for the future?
Well, it's ironic that this conversation is being centered around like the anniversary of Philadelphia, right? And we know that Philadelphia in many ways is the birthplace of this nation, is where the Constitution was signed. And I think ironically enough, in this moment, people are questioning whether or not that document applies to them or has ever applied to them. And if it hasn't, how can we reimagine a world in which even our founding fathers did not envision and did not include the diversity or the spectrum of diversity that we're now sitting within. So I think young people are primed specifically for that conversation because we have grown up in a world in which so much information has been readily available to us. We have interacted with so many different communities from a very young age, the vast majority of us, not all of us. And so what young people are asking for is a reimagining of racial justice in this country, a reimagining of politics and who can participate and who can be at the table, a reimagining of how we treat our planet and not just taking from it, but also ensuring that there's something to be left for future generations. And so it's an interesting time to be a part of these conversations, but it also is a trying time for communities who have oftentimes been pushed to the very margins of society and felt like they haven't had their voices heard.
Absolutely, I completely agree, and that is what we are charged with at Philadelphia 250. So thank you for saying that so succinctly and clearly. Natalie, what are your thoughts about reimagining assumptions?
So when we have these conversations about economic disparity, specifically on the basis of race and specifically how it affects Black people in America, we start to talk about things, we start to frame 4 centuries of slavery in the United States as terrorism. We look at Jim Crow South very differently. We talk about the systemic structures around segregation, segregated housing, segregated healthcare, segregated education, redlining. And what we need to reimagine is that this is actually American history. Often we have treated these touch points in our history as only being part of Black history, but it's actually uniquely American. And so when we talk about a much more inclusive approach that doesn't just stop at diversity, doesn't just stop at inclusivity, but actually moves the needle to equity, we have to reimagine the stories that we have been telling ourselves. History, it's a pun, but there's no accident that the word story is in history. And she or he who gets to write it gets to, name, the heroes, the heroines. And so the work that you all are doing, Danielle and Jamira, is really essential so that we understand in a much more holistic and integrative way the stories that can really pave the path for the future. And the other thing I've been saying quite a bit in my speaking and my writing is that days of uncertainty are designed for creativity. We are not going to see our way out of such complexity with a linear Gantt chart. You will be incredibly frustrated if you take a very traditional project management approach.
As somebody who comes from a creative field myself, I certainly think that way. And it's interesting because I often get asked by others who, when I'm introducing Philadelphia 250, they say, so what are you doing? Like, what are you making? What are you guys doing? And, also again, as a designer, I'm saying, well, we're working strategically to figure out what we want to leave behind and why before we decide what the things are. What I've realized is that, I know that my response of we're going through a strategic process, we're going to figure it out, we're having lots of meaningful conversations, resonates better with younger generation and people who are in creative or community-based fields, because they know the value of listening and learning and then responding. So I'm curious if you guys have any suggestions on what would be good processes to extract some ideas from different folks that we're working with.
So first of all, I just want to build a little bit on the last great bit of comments you made, Danielle. Democracy is messy, right? And it just so happens creativity loves mess. And I should clarify how I'm thinking about creativity. It's my perspective that we have ghettoized creativity in the arts for far too long, and we've mystified it. And we say terms like the creative type, or I'm not a creative, or the creatives will handle it. And it's toggling between wonder and rigor to solve problems. And that's really important. You have to be incredibly audacious, big blue sky asking of how we can interrupt the stories we've been telling ourselves. And you have to be quite rigorous. Yeah, there has to be discipline and time on task spent. So creativity requires both of those things. It's not just doing whatever you feel like. So a creative process that I think moves the needle forward in this work that Philadelphia 250 is doing is, I'm biased. I'm a qualitative researcher. So a lot of it would start with documenting and collecting the stories of a multiplicity of people, because in my view, stories are data too. We think big data is super sexy, which I guess it is. But in the ideal world, we would be integrating the quant and the qualitative. So really having a systematic way of collecting people's stories. And that way you kind of put some meat on the bones to understand the multiplicity of perspectives that are important.
That's really, really interesting. And one of the values of Philadelphia 250 is actually called people's histories. So we've recognized that people's histories needs to be at the forefront of 2026. Jamira, what are some of your thoughts about thinking about the important processes to include while we're thinking about 2026?
I would say shared leadership and shared accountability. To your point, the reason why I think artists and young people are more open to the way in which you describe this initiative is that for them, it seems like an opportunity for collaboration, that they do feel like they can have some sort of buy-in in the process, and that it's not all like the cake isn't baked, right? And their job is to now feed it to everyone else. When really it's like we're still deciding on the ingredients, we're still deciding on how hot to make the oven. And I think that is a process of really including folks from a wide range of communities, allowing them to really design the process, but also the implementation of it, the evaluation of it, and the outputs that come from that. Because I think that's when you can gain more knowledge, as well as ensure that what you're creating is what the people actually want, and not just with those who have the privilege of being at the table can design for them.
Can you give me a specific example, Jamira, about a youth initiative or a youth-led, a youth response to a big issue that you might have been working on, as an example, like what that structure looked like?
Yeah, so I'll give a Philadelphia example. But this was like 2011. The city was thinking about closing the libraries in school. I mean, the libraries and pools, schools wouldn't be so far off considering this environment. They were considering, because they said that by their data, one, they didn't have the money, but also that young people weren't utilizing those facilities. I was the head of the executive director for the Philadelphia Youth Commission. And what we decided to do was to bring a sample of the Philadelphia youth together at City Hall to do an on-the-spot survey with elected officials present about whether or not young people are actually utilizing those facilities. And so we brought about 500 young people together in City Hall. We did a survey that asked them questions like, did you use the pools? Did you go to the library? What activities did you participate? How often did you utilize those services? What we found out is that young people, to the elected officials' point, young people didn't use those facilities. But the reasons why they didn't wasn't because they weren't interested, but that there were barriers to those engagements. And so we asked a series of questions of, would you use it if they were closer to home, or that the hours were different? And so we were able to make a compromise which was an idea created by the Philadelphia Youth Commission, which was 21 young people, was that instead of closing those facilities, is that they would modify those hours. And so it's like, when you include more people, it requires you to ask different questions. It requires you to evaluate whether or not their unique circumstances are being impacted because of something. And it's not always negative, but it damn sure isn't always positive. And I think for me, I've always just been interested in who's not in the room and how do we invite them into the room, but also how do we kind of remove those walls and ensure that more people are included in the conversations.
What I really like about Jamira's example is that it points out that not only going beyond the surface yes, no questions, because there's a gap analysis between what people say and what people do. Like if I had to answer a survey about how often do you work out, and I might answer, 5 days a week, but if you observe my behavior, maybe I get there 2.5 times a week. And so then if you start to peel back on the why and collect people's stories and look in their eyeballs and have conversations, then you understand, well, it might be a transportation issue. It might be a childcare issue. So we have to go beyond the typical means of how we think we're collecting information in the best way, either to have more nuanced survey material or get out of the building, the metaphorical building right now, and really talk to people and understand, the drivers from their perspective about why they are or are not engaged in certain things.
What are your thoughts about what you would like the city to look like in 2026? If we can really lean in to using what we've talked about, reimagining assumptions, building better pathways for youth engagement, responding to those needs, being hypersensitive to what the issues on the ground are. I really want to drive Philadelphia 250 to do. And I want to hold us accountable to do that. These are really big goals and really big tasks. If we can do that with leaders such as yourselves as being partners in our doing that, what would you imagine the city could be like in 5 or 6 years from now in 2026?
So the way I envision kind of what Philadelphia can look like is a place in which, communities are integrated a little bit more, where folks are not seeing differences or the separation of differences as a negative, but as something that really offers to the character of the city. I also see a city that isn't faced with the economic struggles that many communities, particularly communities of color, are struggling with as they sit oftentimes right next to very wealthy neighborhoods, like I did in West Philadelphia. So yeah, I wanna see a city that's not just inclusive in the identity that we offer, but in how we actually engage with each other and ensuring that people really have access to equitable opportunities to not only just improve the circumstances of their communities, but more importantly, to improve the circumstances of their own lives.
Natalie, what is your vision or your ideas of what we could reach for 2026?
My dream is that Philadelphia is the first city that figures out how to have gentrification without displacement. My aunt and uncle who own their row house at 52nd and Race have always wanted to be able to walk to a coffee house and to feel safe getting off the L. My mom, who is still in East Mount Airy, which by the way, Mount Airy is a classic example of redlining when you know the history of West Mount Airy and East Mount Airy. I want our city to be an actionable thought leader in this national dilemma, where, just because you start to have nice things available to you in your community and socioeconomic diversity and a diversity of commercial offerings, that it does not mean displacement. I think it's hard, but I think that if we make a decision that that's what matters to us, and that we could then become really incredible role models for other cities around the country, then let's have at it.
Natalie, do you have any other thoughts that you want to say specifically about your new book that's out that would be a great, highly relevant lesson for us to know here at Philadelphia 250 to learn from before we close things out?
Well, thank you for that opportunity. I would just invite all listeners, if they want a sneak peek into the book, they can go to figure8thinking.com, the number 8, it's not spelled out, and you'll see immediately on the homepage at the top of the page a banner that you can click, and you can download the first introduction, the first chapter, totally complimentary.
I just want to thank both of you so much for a fabulous conversation. I look forward to working with both of you more on what we need to do as we plan for Philadelphia 250 and 2026. Thank you for your time. You guys are both massively, so inspirational. It's so exciting. This has been Danielle DiLeo Kim for Philadelphia 250s in the Pursuit. Hi, I'm Danielle DiLeo Kim, Executive Director of Philadelphia 250. In 2026, the country will commemorate the 250th anniversary of American independence. I invite you to listen in and get inspired to take action as Philadelphia 250 brings together thought leaders and change makers to share what those founding promises mean to them. Now and in the pursuit to 2026.
I was impressed to a different magnitude by your interpretation and your, yes.
You so spot on. Everything you saying makes so much sense. It's exactly the way I treat my kids.
All right, Lisa. What you got? It's inspiring.
We should definitely hang out. Let's set a date for that.
I'm coming for the wontons.
I made a lot of wontons.
Yes.